All right, and welcome on into today's presentation. We're going to talk about considerations when moving from MIM to SailPoint if you're so inclined. And so this is Scott Easton with Easton IT, longtime MIM developer. We recently completed a major SailPoint IdentityNow deployment for a major US hospital and learned a lot along the way about IdentityNow, the foibles of that product, and really some considerations that if you're thinking about moving to MIM, what do you need to know about identity now and things to be aware of? We're going to talk about things that you need to know as far as when you're getting ready to, or if you decide to move to SailPoint. We're going to discuss the sample architecture for identity now so you understand basically how the system works. I'm also going to talk about some key use cases that we did for this particular healthcare entity, but these are also very germane for the most part for any type of industry, especially if you are really focused on HR, say PeopleSoft driven provisioning, deprovisioning to Active Directory. So I think that's kind of the key thing. And we'll talk about maybe a little extra for those of you that are on the healthcare side, specifically around Epic and some interesting things that I found there. We're going to talk about some key findings from working with Identity Now, specifically to how it relates to MIM, but also I think this would be really good for anyone who's considering moving or implementing to Identity Now to know as well. And then finally, we're going to do some recommendations. I'll give you my bottom line recommendations about Identity Now and about how you can proceed forward. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to give you my contact information if you have any questions or you need any help. All right, so let's jump into the overview. So Easton IT recently completed a SailPoint IdentityNow deployment for enterprise clients, specifically a very large hospital here in the US. There are some key lessons learned that are directly applicable to other organizations that want to possibly replace MIM with SailPoint IdentityNow, or even just implement SailPoint IdentityNow on your own without replacing MIM or a prior identity management system. All right, so let's talk about the project goals from this particular SailPoint IdentityNow implementation. So as I talked about in the overview, the main focus was HR-driven provisioning, specifically from PeopleSoft to Active Directory as well as Epic. The client also wanted to use a tool called SailPoint Access Insights to create user roles and assign access based on HR data. Finally, they also wanted to synchronize HR data from obviously PeopleSoft to AD and then over to Epic as well. So very similar to what you might find in a standard MIM deployment where job title, phone number, first name, last name, you'd want to sync from HR over to Active Directory and any connected system. And then finally, this client was specifically looking to assign Active Directory group membership and linked templates in Epic to specific user roles developed by the SailPoint Access Insights tool, which is essentially the role mining and role packaging tool that you could find in SailPoint IdentityNow, which we'll jump into in a little bit more. All right, so there's some key things to know in this particular scenario. So number one, the SailPoint deployment model is significantly different than the way MIM works. It's also going to be, SailPoint IdentityNow is going to be significantly more expensive than MIM. There are a couple of reasons for that. Specifically, you're going to have to purchase third-party licenses for SailPoint IdentityNow, whereas if you own MIM and you have Azure AD Premium, then MIM is essentially free like a puppy, meaning that you own the licenses, but obviously you would have to, if you used a third party, pay for implementation services, where SailPoint, you're essentially buying the functionality a la carte. So the lifecycle management portion, which is essentially provisioning, deprovisioning from HR, is one module. If you want to use the role mining portion of it, in IdentityNow, then that's an extra charge. So everything in SailPoint is essentially a la carte, whereas the core functionality in MIM is free. And if you're not so much familiar with MIM licensing, I would refer you back to one of the prior videos that I did with David Stedman, where we got into the licensing side of this. Next thing to know about IdentityNow is that I found the functionality specifically for Active Directory very limited in what it can do compared to other on-prem identity management systems, including MIM. So we'll talk about that a little bit further about some things that we ran into there. Additionally, and this can be a pro and a con, but you will be relying on SailPoint for platform support, meaning that SailPoint IdentityNow is a cloud-based tool. You're going to be living in the SailPoint cloud. You don't control the hardware or the tenant itself, and so SailPoint will be doing the support. So again, that could be a positive if you're tired of running MIM infrastructure or you don't have the folks to manage SailPoint on-prem. So again, pro and con there. Next, I would say that you are going to need some type of third-party assistance to successfully implement IdentityNow. The specific reason for that is that any type of identity management project is going to be, by its nature, very complex, lots of moving parts, and then SailPoint IdentityNow itself has its own foibles. There are limitations, workarounds that you may not necessarily be aware of. And so again, I would certainly recommend getting a trusted SailPoint partner to help out with that type of implementation. Finally, the last thing to know, and I've touched on this module a few times already, but the Access Insight module, which is again, the role mining tool from SailPoint, which I think came out in May of 2022, if I'm not mistaken. It is a little pricey, but I do feel that it is well worth the money, especially if you as an organization don't have the data analyst or the ability to really crunch your entitlements that every user has to try to figure out what business role or types of users gets what. So again, somewhat new here. I think that the Access Insight module is definitely going to be a good investment if you don't have that type of capability. All right, so let's get into the sample architecture for SailPoint and how it looks now. Just for everyone, just to be upfront, I developed this chart or this graph myself. This is not anything official from SailPoint. So I'm going to use it for illustrative purposes only. So in the sample architecture here, we've got the identity management cloud, which you see up top. We've got the virtual appliance, the VA cluster here in the center, and the on-prem communication between cloud and your HR system and Active Directory and Epic, that's all controlled through this virtual appliance that you see here in the center part of the screen. And essentially, that's the way that the IdentityNow cloud talks to all your on-premise systems. So from there, you'll have a number of connectors inside of the Identity Cloud, things to connect to, say, a SQL view in PeopleSoft, a connector specifically to Epic, one to Active Directory, and then really for those of you that live in the Azure world, you would just basically write everything to Active Directory, say for group management, account provisioning, licensing for M365 and whatnot inside of Active Directory groups. And then my recommendation, at least for now, is to just let Azure AD Connect sync everything up to Office 365. I know that SailPoint has an Azure connector, but I don't necessarily feel like, at least I didn't find a compelling reason to use the Azure connector inside of SailPoint, especially if you already have AAD Connect up and running. I didn't find a compelling case to stick with it. So that's just a quick overview here again, that the IdentityNow cloud is obviously resides in SailPoint. One important thing to consider here is that the IdentityNow cloud is very similar to, say, an apartment building. So you have a space in that apartment building, and you have to live with other tenants in that apartment building, and you're restricted to what you can do. So obviously you can't, play loud noise after a certain hour or do certain things to your apartment without prior approval. And the IdentityNow cloud works very similar to that, where you're restricted in what you can do inside of that IdentityNow cloud. For the most part, you can get through and make adjustments and whatnot. But again, you won't have the ultimate flexibility like you will, say, for instance, with MIM. MIM is a single family house that you own free and clear, and you don't really have any neighbors that you need to worry about. And you can basically do whatever you want to with MIM. SailPoint, again, is not the same way. So an important distinction when you think about going down this road. How does SailPoint work? So we talked about this in the prior slide in showing that sample architecture. But again, SailPoint IdentityNow is a cloud-based tenant. You're restricted to playing within the rules of that homeowners association. There's that virtual on-premises appliance, which is Linux-based, I believe. I think SailPoint may also have a Windows version of it. And that is the gateway to the IdentityNow cloud, as well as all of your on-premise connectors. So the IdentityNow cloud has the business logic. It will essentially go through that virtual appliance to make the various calls out to your target systems, bring the data in, and execute that business logic stored in the cloud. Something else to understand as far as the differences between SailPoint IdentityNow and MIM is that shouldn't say MIM. SailPoint is really based on role-based access, meaning that you will be creating business roles, say an accounting role, a finance role, if you're in healthcare, a nursing role, and then you'll essentially assign access, attributes, group membership to that specific role, and then SailPoint will apply the business logic to it for creating accounts, putting people in groups and whatnot. Whereas in MIM, you would be doing this all through, say, metaverse provisioning code to create AD accounts, metaverse provisioning code to deprovision or move accounts when someone is terminated, and then in the MIM portal, creating criteria-based groups based on HR data to assign group membership. The cool thing about the roles in SailPoint is that it's kind of one and done, meaning that you'll create a business role for, again, our fictional accountant position or a fictional nurse position. And then you just add the different groups in there, and it does its magic. So you're not having to constantly create criteria for each group like you do in the MIM portal, that's very nice from a SailPoint perspective. I'm going to talk about one con here, which we found in SailPoint, is that SailPoint IdentityNow uses the idea of birthright access and attribute synchronization. And basically what that birthright model is it's an all or nothing type of process, meaning that if you fit this, if you're in scope for SailPoint and you're active in PeopleSoft, then you're going to get an account provisioned no matter what. Ditto for the attributes, synchronization, and whatnot. And I'll talk more about some of the downside of that model. But I'll be upfront with you. For those of you that are running MIM, I think that this is a big problem and a big change to the way that you might be used to working. And I do have some major concerns about this model, so we'll discuss that further. Um, on the plus side, SailPoint has individual connectors like MIM. So in MIM, you've got management agents to Active Directory or SQL Server or whatnot. And it's very similar inside of SailPoint. Now, I will say with those connectors, some work great. Um, in fact, better than MIM. Others don't work all that great and or have a lot of limitations, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So let's talk about the use cases that we did on this particular IdentityNow implementation. So the first one was using the SailPoint Access Insights module to analyze AD and Epic data along with PeopleSoft to derive end user roles. So essentially, right, we're using that tool to analyze the data and based on, say, job code or department, coming up with the various roles that we would want to package up. Next, we wanted to do that classic HR provisioning or driven provisioning to AD, where we're creating AD accounts, creating Epic accounts, all that good stuff. So pretty standard. Next use case was actually assigning Office 365 groups for licensing over in Azure. Again, pretty straightforward. Plan is to pop those into a given role and let IdentityNow replicate that down to Active Directory and over to Azure via AAD Connect. We also would use HR to do the standard HR-driven terminations, disabling the accounts, and essentially limiting someone's access inside of Active Directory. And then finally, the classic HR attribute sync from AD or from HR over to AD. So you might do something like the job title is changed in HR. We want to sync that over to AD and Epic. First name might change, so on and so forth. So nothing magical, pretty standard use case that you would see in MIM as well. And so very similar here. The big difference, I'd say, in the use cases was the role mining side of this. Let's talk about the key findings here from this particular SailPoint IdentityNow implementation, specifically to how it relates to MIM, and even for those that are thinking about changing from another system or just going straight up. So first off, if your staff has knowledge of MIM and you're able to operate the system today for the most part on your own, I think that's fantastic. You have a great starting point for your IdentityNow implementation, but I think that it's not going to be sufficient, and specifically because IdentityNow is a completely different technology than MIM. So you will need to go to SailPoint training. You definitely will need to send your people to SailPoint training to learn the system. So again, I think you'd have a good basis if you've got MIM folks that are very knowledgeable and capable on staff. You'll just need to invest in training with SailPoint. Second, you are going to need a lot of hand-holding, most likely with a third-party service provider to actually help with the implementation. Again, from the complexity of the product and just interfacing with SailPoint, I really suggest getting a trusted partner to help with that implementation. The SailPoint deployment model, as I touched on prior, is very different than MIM, and I think it's really fraught with a number of dangers which require a significant workaround. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in detail for our MIM folks out there. If you're a manager or a non-technical person, this may not make a lot of sense to you, but for the MIM folks out there, this is a key point to pay attention to. So the way that SailPoint works is that, again, we talked about that birthright model where it's an all or nothing model. So it's very difficult to, out of the box, segment your users as far as who you want provisioned, all of those type of things. It lacks a lot of flexibility that MIM does. Number one. Number two, the other key problem with this product is that there is not the concept of a synchronization preview or being able to take a look at a connector space and see what the pending exports are. So when SailPoint does its aggregation, which is essentially it's the same in MIM where you say synchronization. It's essentially the same thing. In MIM, you're able to actually, before you send, say, your changes down to Active Directory, you can see in the connector space, I've got 10 adds, 20 updates, 5 renames, all of that type of stuff. The problem with SailPoint IdentityNow is that there is no concept of that. And essentially, when you deploy this, you can't see what changes the system wants to do on a grand scale. You may be able to look at an individual user and take a look and see what it wants to do, but there is no report out of the box, at least currently when we did this implementation, that tells you all the upcoming changes. And I think that that's a big problem, and I hope that SailPoint addresses that, because now for those of you that are in management, if you're deploying this tool and you don't know what it's going to change, who it wants to change, it's fraught with danger. So I think that this is a big shortcoming on SailPoint's part, and I really hope that they fix this or develop some type of report to address this, because when you do an identity management implementation, being able to view the changes and understand exactly what's going to happen in your environment is really key. So that's enough on that topic, but hopefully SailPoint, if you're watching, hope that you'll do something about it. And for those of you that are implementing IdentityNow, this is a big warning. Next key finding in our dealings, specifically with SailPoint, is that when dealing with their support organization, I found that they were very reluctant to support the IdentityNow product. We had a number of dealings with the level 1 people where essentially we sent in tickets about some performance issues with virtual appliances and a couple of other questions. And basically their response was, hey, this really isn't our problem. You need to go fix this yourself, which obviously is not something, if you're paying that cost of licenses, that you want to hear. You want to get help. And so the net result here is that we had to escalate several times to get assistance from SailPoint to help on some troubleshooting. And the good news is that once we got that escalation and got to the right people, we were able to get the help that we needed. But quite frankly, the level 1 support, it was very, very difficult and very frustrating. So that's something to keep in mind. Next key finding on the plus side is that the SailPoint Access Insight module worked very well, and I was actually really impressed with it. So that was really good. So the next key finding is that you're going to need a development environment that is going to match production. And I know that we all know that when we do any type of software or system deployment, that dev should match Active Directory. Now, how many of us actually do that is another question here, but in the case of an IdentityNow implementation, I'm going to strongly recommend that you do as much as you possibly can to try to match your development environment to production. And there's some specific reasons there. Number one, especially if you're using the Access Insights module, you want the data in your HR system and in Active Directory, and of course Epic if you're a healthcare organization, to look as closely as possible as it does in production. And specifically, you can use that data to help derive your roles, to try it out so you're not playing in production. Because if you make a mistake in production, then some very unexpected things can happen, which unfortunately happened with this client. We weren't involved in this problem, but the client was trying out some of the role features in production. They made a mistake, and long story short, they locked out access for a period of time to some key medical facilities in their environment. We were able to get it restored, but again, lesson learned here is that get a development environment that matches production and do everything that you possibly can in development before trying it out in prod. The next key finding is that the SailPoint Active Directory connector is very immature compared to what we have in MIM, but the AD group portion actually worked really well. So let me talk about the shortcomings in the AD management or connector, if you will, inside of SailPoint. So number one, the ability to say call PowerShell easily inside of that connector, we weren't able to figure it out. We were just at a point in the project where the documentation was rather limited, and so for doing PowerShell calls to act on Active Directory, we weren't able to figure it out. Hopefully, SailPoint has updated their documentation around this, but that's a big shortcoming. Number two, another problem that we had was the ability to move user organizational units. So for the technical folks out there, especially those that are familiar with MIM, one of the classic scenarios is that if you are connected to the HR system and someone is working in accounting and they live in the accounting OU inside of Active Directory, then they transfer to the finance department. You can easily write code inside of MIM to move that object or at least stage that object for a rename in Active Directory to move it to that new OU. And you can even use the rule extension code to do some type of lookup saying, based on this job code and department location, put them in this OU. That was not very easy to do inside of SailPoint IdentityNow, and quite frankly, we weren't able to find documentation on it, and luckily that turned out not to be a major requirement for this particular project, but it was not easy to find. And again, hopefully SailPoint has updated documentation around this. So just another key thing to be aware of. Then finally, the other big shortcoming on the SailPoint IdentityNow connector, and again, really important point for the MIM, people that manage the MIM environment need to know, is that inside of the IdentityNow connector, you can't limit the number of writes that SailPoint will do to Active Directory. So with MIM in an export profile, you can tell it in the export profile only update 100 accounts and stop. Inside of SailPoint IdentityNow, there's no speed bump like that. And so again, that I think is a big problem when we talked about earlier, you can't see what changes the system wants to make, and B, you can't limit the changes that it does want to make. Your deployment model is essentially turning the system loose and cleaning up the pieces of any surprises, which I'm really not a fan of and was extraordinarily concerning during this implementation. So we had all sorts of workarounds to try to make sure that, God forbid, we didn't lock somebody out or a doctor out or a whole department out if a mistake was made. So again, I believe that throttle function for exports is available in the on-prem version of SailPoint, but it's definitely not in the, or at least the time of this recording, is not available inside of IdentityNow. So that would be another big recommendation of SailPoint is you want to be able to configure or have the clients configure how many writes are going to be done to Active Directory. So meaning I want to limit it to 100 user account updates or 100 group updates, so on and so forth. There's got to be some type of throttle to deploy this system safely. we talked about in the next point here that there's limited PowerShell support for the system or for this platform. The documentation again was lacking. So if you're a big PowerShell group or user, just be aware that you're gonna want to try to look for that documentation up front or have SailPoint support get it for you. So you can actually utilize that functionality inside of IdentityNow. Um, the next key finding here is that the out-of-the-box reporting for IdentityNow was quite limited compared to, say, what you would see on-prem. I will acknowledge in MIM, there's basically no reporting. So anything that SailPoint's got is obviously an improvement. But when it comes to reports, and again, talking about the incident that happened on this particular IdentityNow implementation where the client inadvertently deployed a role and it impacted a bunch of users, there was no real way to very quickly pull a report saying, inside of IdentityNow saying, hey, these particular people were changed or these groups were updated. It was very, very difficult to try to figure out what was going on. I think ultimately SailPoint gave us some type of query to be able to figure this out. But again, in a panic situation or when you've had a bad day, there weren't a lot of reports. So something else to consider here as part of your implementation. Next key finding was system logging in IdentityNow was also of limited value. So the specific scenario here is that virtual appliance, which is the gateway between the IdentityNow cloud and on-prem, was having all sorts of performance problems. We actually upped the logging on that virtual appliance to like the highest level, but it really didn't give us any useful information. So at the end of the day, we had to go back to SailPoint and ask for help, which again, turned into a number of escalations since the level 1 folks were not really interested in helping there. So something else to consider, and hopefully SailPoint will improve. On the plus side, developing and deploying roles was really easy. And again, I think that module worked really well. And I was very impressed with it. And frankly, I wish that we had something like that in MIM. All right, so let's get down to brass tacks and talk about recommendations here. So these are some key things that I would really strongly urge you to think about. So number one, when setting up your project, you're going to, especially if you're deploying the role-based module here, you're going to want to have a strong leader to handle and lead the RBAC side of your project. It shouldn't be something that's an afterthought, but it needs to be a dedicated pillar inside of your IdentityNow project where that leader, program manager, PM, or whatnot is driving data analysis, making sure that you're working with the business to rationalize, say in the instance of nurses, what AD groups should everyone be in? Do they really need all this access? Right? There's a lot of moving parts there on the role management side and a lot of negotiation with the business. So don't neglect that. Make sure that you have a strong leader to be able to help you with that. You also want to have a dedicated project manager to handle the lifecycle management side of this. And essentially, that's the provisioning, deprovisioning, the account creation, and Active Directory and Epic, getting data out of PeopleSoft, all that good stuff. So the lifecycle management is really a discrete and separate pillar to the role-based side. Think about it this, is that the roles and the HR data are essentially the gasoline they're going to feed this engine. So having strong leadership in both of those pillars, I would strongly recommend. We touched upon this earlier in some of the key lessons learned. You're definitely going to want to have a development environment that matches as closely as possible what's going on in production so you don't have surprises when you get to production. So in addition to the data challenges that I mentioned in this project, also, when we did our Active Directory deployment, we found that there were some key differences between prod AD because of the way that the forest was set up versus the development environment and the way that the forest and domain was set up there. We had to make some minor adjustments, but again, it's no fun having a surprise when you move to production. The next key recommendation is that send people to SailPoint training. I don't make any money recommending SailPoint training, but it's something that you really need to invest in. And part of your startup cost with SailPoint, they will include some training modules, but the more training that you can invest in your team and your ability to stand alone and manage the system by yourself without the need for third parties is money well spent. Next recommendation, and this is really more for the executives on the call, is you're going to want to get upfront commitment from SailPoint regarding their support model, SLAs, escalation paths, all of those type of things, because again, we just did not have the best experience with the level 1 folks at SailPoint, and it really, there were a lot of escalations, and I'll leave it to your imagination about what those escalations entailed, but we really had to pull out the stops to get help. So again, for the executives and managers on the call, key point, talk to your SailPoint rep, talk to your customer success rep over at SailPoint, and make sure that you know exactly, if you have a problem, what that escalation path looks like. Don't wait to do this. Next key recommendation is you want to understand the limits and dangers of the SailPoint deployment model that we talked about. And you're going to have to determine the appropriate workarounds for your organization. And again, those key limitations are A, birthright access, the all or nothing model that they use when they do these deployments, and B, the inability to actually preview or see what type of changes are going to happen after you've synchronized the data. So you have no visibility into what it's going to do. And then finally, the third problem is there's no out-of-the-box report that shows you what it did very easily. So that's something that you're going to want to, again, think about up front and make sure that you know how you're going to handle those situations. So the next recommendation here is that, as I've said many times, the Access Insight module, I was super impressed with. I thought it worked great, and I think it's definitely worth the investment. Next recommendation here is that you want to determine upfront what type of reports that you're expecting from the system. So again, it might be that change report or a role report or anything like that. Basically, you want to, especially from an identity operations perspective, think about what type of information you want if you have a bad day. Don't assume that the data is going to come or those reports are going to come out of the box, because they probably are. Next recommendation here is really ask some tough questions to SailPoint, not the sales reps, but to the technical folks about the Active Directory connector and the limitations there. And the specific limitations, again, are A, making it very difficult to do, say, OU renames. Rule extension transformations can be somewhat difficult. And then the final point here is that there's no throttle to limit the number of updates that go to Active Directory or even Epic. And again, I think that's a big problem, and SailPoint really needs to fix that. So again, I would ask those questions. The sales reps, I'm sure that they'll tell you what they think they know, but I would really press the technical folks and get it from the horse's mouth here. Finally, on the recommendation side, you want to review the PowerShell capabilities inside of SailPoint, and you want to really understand, again, what's possible, what's not possible with PowerShell and SailPoint. Again, this is one that needs to go to the technical folks and not so much the sales and marketing people. The technical folks will be in the know. The salespeople will obviously do their best to tell you the truth as far as they understand it. But again, if you're a MIM developer, you want to get the truth directly from the SailPoint technical folks. All right, so let's move over to the bottom line, is where I stand on IdentityNow. So my bottom line recommendation here is that if you're thinking about going forward with SailPoint IdentityNow, proceed with caution. Um, Again, there are a number of issues that I have with the system that I've spoken about here. Those being the inability to see what the system wants to do prior to committing changes to Active Directory, Epic, or any other target system out there. And then B, not being able to do any type of reporting about what's changed, or at least not being able to do it easily. And then C, not being able to limit the number of changes that are going down to these target systems is a big concern. Um, the next key point, when it comes to the bottom line, is that with any type of cloud system, SailPoint, Azure, anything like that out there, currently the cloud versions of these systems are not going to have feature parity with their on-prem counterparts. So SailPoint IDN, while it's good, does not have the full robust features that the on-premise version has. So you're going to need to be prepared for that and decide if you can live with it or not. The next bottom line point here is that you're going to want to get upfront commitment from SailPoint about the support model and really understanding the what that support model and escalation model looks like. And you're also going to want to get documentation. Think about the documentation that you're going to need specifically around Active Directory, PowerShell, those type of things. I will say this, that with regards to the Epic connector, I thought the Epic connector worked great. It was awesome. SailPoint's done a really good job with that. So if you're a healthcare organization and you're looking to manage Epic accounts, entitlements, and even SCRs, which I think the module for that just came out recently, the core Epic connector works fantastic. Whereas in MIM, I've actually had to write custom code to do all this, and that's obviously costly and fraught with potential errors, where the Epic connector, I thought, did just a wonderful job. To be able to successfully deploy IdentityNow, you may very well likely have to do a number of workarounds kind of based on what we've talked about here today, to be able to make sure that you can deploy this product without accidentally causing all sorts of harm in your organization. So again, things to consider when trying to get this thing deployed. And then finally, I will say that getting a trusted partner is going to be super critical to help you navigate SailPoint, to A, from an organization perspective, and then B, just understanding the nuances of the product and how to successfully deploy it. So again, look for that trusted partner who can help you. All right. So finally, I want to just take a moment and thank you for staying around, watching this whole presentation to the end. Certainly, if you have any questions or you're looking for assistance either with MIM or with your SailPoint IdentityNow deployment, certainly feel free to reach out to me. We'll pop my email address up on the screen here in just a second, but certainly feel free to drop me a line. And again, thank you so much for watching this, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.